and welcome to Taking Liberties, episode number 30. So we've hit the big 3-0 this year. And also, as a side thing, we've had 3 weeks with over 100 listeners. So I want to thank everyone out there for listening, and we're going to keep them coming as long as people are ready to listen to us. So today, we've got Lee over in WA.
Hello.
Austin over in Sydney.
I'd like to point out that I tell people this is our 25th episode for modesty.
And Steve in Victoria.
G'day.
And I, of course, am Vickers, and we're going to start talking with the big one, the thing that libertarians always talk about, and that is gun control. So last week, obviously, there was the shooting that happened. We've kind of let it percolate a bit, let everybody get their feelings out. But I think now it's time for us to take on the topic after everyone else has gotten to it. So I'll just throw open to let anyone start. I'm expecting our resident American, obviously, to jump in.
Look, I actually have a few rules about talking about gun control that I'll bring up later. So I'd actually like you guys to chime in, and I'll tell you how you're thinking about the problem totally wrong.
Well, I mean, this is one of the things that I have as a bit of a hobby horse. So if anybody follows me on Facebook, they'll know that basically what I find is there's a shooting, there's a bunch of articles about outrage, and there's a lot of counter articles from libertarians and people, and that's when I get on my hobby horse. So. I mean, I think the key thing is prohibition doesn't work. It doesn't matter if it's guns, doesn't matter if it's drugs, doesn't matter if it's migrant workers. Or prohibition never works. So if there is to be a solution to very specific instances of mass shootings where some crazy person goes and shoots up a bunch of people, it's not going to be through taking away guns. Like leaving aside whether. Whether people there's a right to own a gun or there's not a right to own a gun or, any of that. If your solution is prohibition, it won't work. And really, for the left, their only solution is things that move towards prohibition. So what we've seen in this sort of media cycle this time around is that you're starting to see a few people just outright coming out saying America needs to get rid of all their guns. And certainly that fits in with what basically the mainstream of Australians already think, which is if you get rid of the guns, you get rid of the potential for mass shootings. Well, that will never work. Never in a million years will it work, because pure supply and demand will overcome any laws that you ever create. If you take away a bunch of guns, which, again, we could talk maybe a little bit more, is that's actually questionable that actually happened in Australia, but even if you start taking away guns, the price for an illegal gun goes up. All of a sudden there's more incentive for somebody to import them or to, one that they have stashed away to then sell. This increased price signal will lead to an increase in the supply, which drives down the price. And so, at best, you can make it a little bit more expensive to buy a gun, but you don't make it impossible for somebody to get a gun. So, I mean, I think, before, and I think that's a point at which we can even talk to non-libertarians about and say, if you want to have regulation of guns, prohibition isn't the way to do it. You just need to accept that the guns exist, especially in America, where there's like 300 million of them.
And here, what? 500,000 guns?
Well, yeah.
Well, so I want to come at this from a different side. So every time something like this happens, we talk about how great our gun laws are. I respectfully disagree. And also, we don't want to turn into America. And I'm just like, okay, fine, you don't want to turn into America. How about New Zealand? Right? I'm happy to turn into New Zealand on guns. New Zealand has very liberal gun laws. It's got, in fact, so to the extent where they require the registration of firearms. So they require the registration of a gun holder's license, but they don't require you to register the firearms. Try getting away with that in America, anywhere in America. Not just that, but they allow you silencers, right? They don't allow silencers in America. So
that's only because they're more polite. We don't like silencing anything in America.
That is true.
Nice.
Yeah, that is true. Freedom of speech, right? I mean, if I hate this debate partly because everybody keeps talking about America, and I'm just like, there are other countries you can model it on, and I'm just sitting there going like, look, New Zealand had its own sort of, gun scare way back in 1994. Ours happened in 1996. The New Zealand response wasn't to outright ban their guns. Our response was to outright ban their guns. And if you take a look at the crime statistics across both the countries, and it's good that we can do this, because New Zealand and Australia are very similar. It's kind of like the relationship between Canada and America. Canadians are always apologizing for being American. And because of that closeness in, the culture, you can actually do a proper comparison statistically. And statistically, New Zealand's not that bad. And I'm just like, we can actually have our guns and not have an absurd, murder rate like they do in the United States.
I mean, and that's the thing. It's the US is an outlier. Like it's
an outlier amongst outliers.
Yeah. So I mean, unless you really,
sorry, Austin.
it is more of a violent place.
Several standard deviations above the mean, so I'm happy to be an outlier.
Well, look, and we need to actually say why it's an outlier too, because it actually speaks to some other libertarian issues. It's an outlier because there's a lot of gang warfare in the United States, which is a product of drug prohibition. And issues like that, I mean, straight out of Compton,
the drug war's going on here as well.
It is.
So, yeah.
But for some reason, to a greater extent there. And I think perhaps that's because, well, I don't know why really, but the reality is that's a major factor there, gang warfare. And we need to point that out to people. At the same time, I think Vickers is absolutely right that we need to also look at non-American examples, because that way we're demonstrating that, look, I mean, this idea that, loose gun laws equals we're going to have mass shootings every weekend is not true. It's just a product of America's mad culture, not their gun laws as such.
And I guess
it's just as easy to enter into a mass shooting here where guns are very, very difficult to legally purchase, although easy to get illegally.
I mean, it's worth pointing out gun violence in America. There's like, when people think of the murder rate or the homicide rate with guns, they think all of it's, or maybe some of it's due to these mass shootings, but they actually are a very small fraction of the overall homicide rate.
That is point number 6 on my list.
Well done. Yeah, and essentially the main cause of violence, as Steve pointed out, is drug prohibition related. It's handguns, people kill each other with handguns, and it's to do with the drug trade. So
I don't think you can entirely ignore these school shootings, though. So in the last year, there have only been something like 20 days where there hasn't been a shooting at some school in America. Now, that of course that doesn't mean there's a mass shooting at every school every single day.
Yep.
It just basically means there wasn't a kid that took out a gun and fired a shot at a school.
Yeah. But I mean, even that's something. I mean, that's like if you want to start talking about, well, who's going to be involved in the bulk of gun violence? Who's going to be involved? It's going to be minorities. Who in America, there's long historical reasons why they are disadvantaged, and they, blacks have been systematically disenfranchised. It's going to make them poorer. It's going to make them more susceptible to be involved in the drug trade and in gangs. And it's the same with Latinos. So, I mean, once you add in those things, it becomes much more understandable with these very high-profile shootings. Like Newtown, like this one in the college, the community college recently. They're very high profile, and they get a lot of media attention. But they actually, there's no real clear understanding of why they actually happen. So yeah, I mean, certainly I know with the Washington Post, I think it was, or a few media outlets have been saying there's been a mass shooting, 2,000 mass shootings in the last 3 years or something, because they use a much broader definition and start including a bunch of things that we don't think of when we talk about mass shootings. What we think of is we think of Aurora and Newtown and Columbine and Port Arthur.
Well, yeah,
that sort of stuff is not it's inexplicable.
That's why I make that distinction, right?
Yeah.
That is why I said it's where a kid has brought a gun to a school and fired a shot.
Yeah.
Well, the reason for that apparently is that I don't know. I mean, there's that reason, drug prohibition. Another reason that the gun advocates in the United States put forward is that there are actually restrictions on teachers possessing firearms in the United States. And as a result,
we're getting to another important point.
Which
that's schools gun-free zones. Yeah.
Gun-free zones, yes. And interestingly enough, in Israel, for example, I know that in the settlement communities, hotly disputed as they are, a lot of people, even teachers, walk around with firearms because
Yep.
there's actually a very high risk of being attacked in those areas. That's leaving aside, the rights and wrongs of the settlement movement. That's a simple fact. People in
Yep.
Israel, near or in the territories themselves, can and do get firearms for protection. Anyway, moving on.
And I don't want to quite segue yet, but just to point out something
Oh,
was
no,
interesting.
I still have a whole...
All right, well,
don't worry.
I just wanted to make just a quick point on what he just said then about being armed. If you look at what happened in Parramatta last week, this young kid, I don't want to talk about the radicalization thing here, but just to talk about the gun control side of things, he walked up to a cop shop, shot a guy in the head, and then it was immediately gunned down. If he'd walked into a shopping centre and opened fire, he could have killed a lot more people than he did, and which was actually surprising me. I thought that would have sort of made sense, but that shows you the difference. Like, if you have people who nearby who are armed,
He's
It was
attacking a
motivated.
symbol of authority. He's
Yeah.
attacking a symbol of authority.
yeah, that's the case.
That's
But
why
it's certainly,
it's-
it points at that if you have people who are readily armed in the near vicinity, you have a lot less deaths, and than if you attack an unarmed group of people, which essentially all of Australia is because of the way our gun laws work.
Which is why, in some ways, Manmonis, or I don't if that is his name. I
Yeah,
forget.
it was.
He was in some ways a bit more devious in the sense that he was also targeting authority in the legal community in Sydney, but he picked a cafe rather than the courts themselves, where there would be security guards to quickly just dispatch him, so to speak. Anyway, so I think that's a major factor
I'm
in
waiting for Austin to prove
shootings
us all wrong.
generally.
I'm not going to prove you wrong. I'm just saying you're not talking about the right issue.
Ooh.
In fact, no one who talks about this is talking about the right issue.
Only
And that
Austin
really is
does. Go on.
simply a numbers game. It's a numbers game. And first of all, I'm not going to provide any citations for the claims I'm making. I encourage you to do your own research. Don't listen to pundits, especially don't listen to pundits after a shooting.
Especially
You'll
pundits
hear
who
gun
are
control
on-
advocates telling you how guns are the worst thing ever and they cause cancer and kill 1 million people every day. And you'll hear gun freedom advocates talking about how guns never did anything bad and no one ever got hurt playing with a gun.
and
obviously-
never take anything on a podcast as true.
right.
That's absolutely right.
So with those caveats,
We are all telling absolute nonsense right
point
now. Go
one,
on.
when you're discussing gun control, gun suicides really shouldn't count in the argument one way or another.
That's true.
That's a nuanced point, but it's used by a lot of people who like gun control to inflate the numbers of gun deaths. A gun suicide should be lumped under suicide, and if you believe that that's a social problem, it should be treated separately than gun violence. Those are two separate issues. So I'm going to remove gun suicides from discussion. Secondly, gun control measures do make guns more costly to obtain. Anyone who says that prohibition doesn't work is oversimplifying the matter. The fact is, prohibition works at making things more difficult to obtain. When guns are illegal, they become more costly. However, they make it more costly to people who place a high value on obeying the law than they do on people who have a low value on obeying the law. In other words, if part of your cost of obtaining an illegal gun is that you don't like breaking the law, it's going to be harder for you to get a gun. Whereas if part of your cost of getting a gun is not obeying the law and you don't care about the law, it's a lower relative cost to you. So, thirdly, that means that cheaper or legal guns make lawful gun violence less costly to the defender. In other words, if guns are legal, you're going to see more instances of people using guns to legitimately protect themselves against aggressors. Flip side of that is that cheaper and legal guns make unlawful gun violence less costly to the perpetrator, right? So, in the same reason that you see less people buying guns to do bad things with, you see less people buying guns to do good things with. There's two costs here that we have to look at. Cheaper and legal guns make the expected cost of crime higher to the perpetrator. In other words, if I'm going to commit a crime and I know that my victim may have a gun, it's going to be more costly to me and I'm less likely to do it. In other words, you have two things. Guns are easier to get, but the cost of using a gun to commit a crime is also higher because I might get shot.
Yep.
So there's these two competing costs, and really you have to balance them out, and that's an empirical question. There's not any particular deontological reason to suspect that one will outweigh the other.
And the thing about that kind of empirical question is that there's probably no empirical answer to it. Anyway.
But
Although
I'm with Austin on this one. No, you can do
Apparently
this.
uncertain in their own ways. Go on.
Number 6. Now, this is what we said before. Mass shootings are tragic and a terrible source of data to base legislation on. It was just true of any outlying event. as much as it's a sad event when a dozen people get shot, or even 6 people get shot, or even one person gets shot, what really matters is the bulk data. If you base laws on tragedy, you get bad laws, and that's true across the board. I think the appropriate thing to do after a time like this is say, this is tragic, let's talk about it in 2 months when we all have a level head, and that's exactly the reason why politicians don't do that and start waving their flag for their side the day after it. They stand on a pile of dead bodies and tell you, nope, guns are great, or nope, guns are terrible, and I think it's offensive, frankly. I'm glad we waited at least a week. All right, now, here we go. From my research, and again, I encourage you to do it yourself, in areas where guns are easy to obtain, making them illegal increases violent crime.
That can happen.
Where it's easy to obtain a gun, whether I can drive over a county and bring a gun in, or whether I can get a gun illegally very cheaply, gun violence is not deterred largely
I've actually seen this study before. I think I know which one you're talking about. It's the
Yep.
yeah. I won't talk about it. No.
Yep. In areas
Spoiler
where
alert.
it's difficult to obtain, making them illegal does not affect or decreases violent crime. So that's like, if it's hard to get a gun into an area, making them illegal actually will have an effect. And so extreme example, in a prison, if guns were legal, you'd see a lot more gun shootings. But because guns are illegal and it's very difficult to get guns into a prison, you don't see a lot of shootings happening in prisons. So those are two far ends of the spectrum, right? Now, given those 2 points, the cost of guns, both illegal and legal, will be expected to decrease over time as technology advances. So we get cheaper guns, mass-produced, and the big factor we haven't mentioned, 3D printed guns, or made guns, which will become easier and more effective to produce as time goes on. So that means even in areas where guns are currently expensive or difficult to obtain, like Australia, although I will reference one study, it's a University of Melbourne study that seemed to show that there was no statistical effect of the gun laws on violent crime. Eventually we're going to reach a point where the costs of gun control are going to outweigh the benefits of gun control. Even if there is a benefit now, at some point it'll be so easy for me to get out my 3D metal printer, press print, get myself an AR-15 and go on a shooting spree. And that cost point will come at some point in the future. So I'm not going to say what we should do now, but I think it's something to consider that in the long term, freedom, as it always is the optimal solution. And that was a long rant, so I'll shut up for a while.
I just want to pick up what you said about prohibition being oversimplistic. I think the reason I say prohibition doesn't work is because the narrative of those who want to prohibit guns is simplistic. They say we need to get the guns out of the hands of these bad people. Well, that's what I mean by it doesn't work. Like, pretty much exactly what you said, which is
narrative. Exactly. It's as if there are no drawbacks.
Exactly. Well, and also that they just sort of imagine that legislation is magic. That is, we can magically take all these guns away, and that there's no economic, impact. Meaning, which is there's no other incentives working around to sort of undermine that particular policy position. So I guess that's what I mean, the difference between, I guess, what I'm talking about and what you're talking about when I say prohibition doesn't work. It's just that there still are guns. You can still get them, but you're right. They do become more expensive, and I agree wholeheartedly with everything you said.
I just realized I talked for like 5 minutes without making a bad joke, and I can say you can never take minutes away.
Anyway, so
we have to be subjected to that, Austin. Please.
more guns. But anyway, so
bullying is wrong.
But anyway, so the main thing that inspired this topic for us here was basically the shooting that happened last week, and the other topic that shooting has sort of sparked up is basically the Islamicization of Australia. I hope I pronounced that right. But there is a substantial group of people in Australia that are afraid of Australia becoming Islamic. Now, that, of course, confuses me a little bit, because I don't understand how a country becomes Islamic, per se. And I don't understand any more other than it's a nativist argument to prevent Islamic immigration. And I think I think they're basically championing people like Geert Wilders to come here and talk about it. And
I think there was an old song about that, becoming Islamic, or maybe it was turning Japanese. I can't remember.
It's Japanese. Yeah.
I mean, well, to be fair, there is a genuine issue of, like, with this young kid. Oh, he gets radicalized somehow. He gets the idea in his head to get himself a gun, or somebody supplies him with a gun, and then he goes and shoots some innocent guy in the head. Like, that's a real thing. Like, it's not just a one-off. Like, we're seeing, there is a small number of angry young Muslim men who, blow up subways and in London, and who like hold up cafes in Sydney, and it's not a huge problem. And I guess this is where my issue with this whole
Not a huge problem.
well,
okay.
it
It's a
is a huge it's a huge problem in the sense that murder is bad. It's a terrible thing. But it's not a huge problem in the sense that all of a sudden we've got hundreds of thousands of angry Muslims getting ready to strap on their suicide vests and charge into into a train. We're seeing a very small number of people who are subject, who are getting to the point where they actually want to hurt people.
Zeb, I have a real question. I don't know the answer. Am I more likely to be killed by a terrorist or struck by lightning in the next year? That's an honest question. If you can find me the numbers by the end of the show, I would be very curious to know them.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let me Google that for you. Or let me ask you to
so-
Google it for yourself.
I will Google it for you. That sounds like a great idea.
My entire take on this topic is, look, the light of liberty is bound to attract a few moths. Just to start off.
That's a great phrase. I gotta remember that one.
My goodness, Vickers.
That's good.
You're really
We should put that on a bumper sticker.
Yeah. So and this is kind of how I regard it. Basically you've got these. To me, this is basically a policing issue. It's not so much an immigration issue.
Yep.
So
Yeah.
it is
Can
one
I,
of the.
Can I stop there and just look? The point these guys are getting at is, first of all, these things weren't happening before. Second of all, they'll say if you look overseas and you look to the places where these radical groups are predominant, there are lots of people out there with these beliefs. And the third thing they'll say is, we don't want those people with those beliefs who have been happily blowing up their own countries coming here to blow up our country. That's the case, and that's the case that we need to answer. So
Yeah, and I was kind of getting to that. So
Yeah.
here's the thing, right? Those people are probably the biggest reason why people want to leave that area, and those people don't like the people leaving that area do not want to be associated with it. When you create this,
Arguable. Go on. I don't know. I don't have the empirical data about that, but
I
it's
don't have
an
the
arguable.
Okay,
Go
no,
on.
I'd say the vast majority of people leaving an area.
Certainly
but-
are fleeing violence, yes, and they're not
Yes.
likely to be very keen on the idea of perpetuating more violence.
Pretty much.
Although
Yeah.
second generation migrants, these people would say,
So-
are more likely to be radicalized, like our 15-year-old. Yeah.
Yes.
Go on.
Yeah, but keep in mind, we also keep these people in our country, right? Like, we don't allow them to leave, per se. Every time these people try to leave, we basically get border force to lock them up and bring them back. I don't know why we do that.
Yeah.
In my mind, we should let them leave. And just go like, yeah, you know what? Go on, go nuts, go
I
out.
quite happily
that-
see the
that's-
Kurds
that's
gun
what I
them
found a
down.
bit
Don't let the
strange
door hit
about-
you out.
Exactly. That's what I found a bit strange about the debate after this shooting happened. I mean, we had Malcolm Turnbull get up and say, if you don't like Australia, you can leave. And Bill Shorten said the same. But there are actually laws that make it illegal for them to leave if they want to,
No, you mean the
fight
laws that were
overseas
passed
or
like
something.
3 months ago?
Exactly. So it's real cognitive
Yeah.
dissonance at work here.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and I guess that this is where you could say, well, there's really a valid reason to strip these people of their citizenship, because we can send, they'll go to join an Islamic State in Iraq, and we say, yeah, don't come back. In fact, we're not going to let you come back, because I think there is a
Well, again,
somewhat reasonable risk of that. But anyway, that's a separate thing.
I think I've explained before that allowing people who change their mind about things like that to come
Yeah.
back is actually a really powerful propaganda tool that we have
Yeah.
at our
It can
disposal.
be.
So yes, it can be. So these are all things that come into this, in my mind, into the space of policing, and
Yeah.
rather community policing more so, which is a term libertarians should be uncomfortable with. But I'm sure the conservatives out there are just going, wait, Vickers just mentioned community policing. That's what we're all about. But basically, in many ways, yes, you're right. Second generation radicalized Muslims tend to be the ones that are causing the problems. But you have to look at what's actually causing that, right? A lot of that element is like basically they're being alienated from the rest of the community. They are being forced, in a way, at a very early stage to identify with this group over there.
I wouldn't say they're being forced, but okay, yes, I get your point. But
Yeah.
they'll always... the
Well,
way
not
these
forced, but
people
like
will go
ushered
is-
in that direction.
Yes. The way these people will frame their argument is, well, look, Vickers, I mean, we don't see Chinese people second generation blowing themselves up. We don't see
fuck
Greeks
off. Like,
second generation blowing
Look,
themselves up.
80 years ago, we were saying keep the Chinese out of this country. What
Yeah.
the fuck? I mean, this is
Well,
ridiculous.
but that's the case that they'll make, because you need to
And,
ask.
and in which case, my answer would be, talk to me again in another 80 years when it's the next marginalised group.
Yeah, and I mean, I think there is, like, conservatives do sort of, they look to Europe in particular. I think in a big way. They say, look, they look at France, they look at UK, where you have these, from my observation, essentially welfare dependent ghettos where you get a lot of migrants who are all poor. They come along, they get angry, they live in a tool community, and they kick out all the non-Muslims. And to that, I'd say, well, that's a problem with the welfare state. You know, if you don't want to have that sort of thing where you have these... And they'll say the same thing about refugees that come here. They say, oh, you know, 2 years after the refugees come here, 88% of them are still on welfare. Well, that's because we forced them to be on welfare, which we've already said before.
They're literally banned. Some of them are literally banned from working legally in this country.
Yeah.
It's incredible.
So,
yeah.
So, I mean, I think that
the mind.
there's a... I guess it's an accurate observation, but a wrong policy prescription. I guess I'd also want to say is there's always going to be an ideology that hates liberal Western values. Like before the Muslims, it was the communists.
Yeah.
And before them, there would have been somebody else. And before them, there would have been somebody else.
Yeah.
You know, and so you always, like, you have to just accept, like, there's a point at which we have to say, well, things are going to happen. Like, bad things, you can't create a country where there's no risk of somebody with a hateful ideology doing a terrible thing.
And you can't treat an entire mass of people as if they're collectively guilty of committing these crimes, and therefore collectively not entitled to refuge or migration.
So,
I mean, there's 390,000 Muslims in Australia. Like, you can't...
Yeah.
So
you can't...
They're not all guilty, and in fact, most of them are pretty decent people.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So just to get to the counterpoint,
not that I've met them all, but you know what I mean.
Just to get to the counterpoint of this, I actually think you can have a perfectly safe country. It's just, you know, you got to lock off all the borders, you got to cover everything in bubble wrap. You have to like have the most authoritarian state.
Nobody can ever.
North Korea. That's North Korea. That's really safe.
I was just getting there. I was going to say, and if we really want that, we can all just move to North Korea.
Yeah.
Right.
Wow. Well done.
Maybe that could be like the status version of you should move to Somalia. Like, hey, if you don't like all this freedom stuff, maybe you should move to North Korea.
Yeah. If only that worked as an argument.
Yeah. Well, I think moving to Somalia is not much of an argument either, but that's another discussion. Yeah, I mean, I think, like, if you say, well, I mean, you look at these lone wolf attacks, essentially, which is what they are. I mean, there's no, and I guess this feeds into a lot of the security state with stuff we've talked about as well, with all these, you know, metadata and the rest of it, which starts tomorrow, I think, by the way.
I doubt the ISPs are ready for it.
Yeah.
I'm sure the legislation says it starts tomorrow,
but you know, like this is a 15-year-old kid who has been either managed to source a gun on his own, which is unlikely, or he's been armed by somebody in his community. Like, unless you can get some sort of contact into that community, you're talking about a meeting that's going to happen in a back room of a mosque. Like, there's very difficult to stop that sort of thing from happening. Like, if some crazy person tomorrow gets the idea in their head to, you know, use a pressure cooker to make a bomb like they did in Boston, you know, it's very hard to track the people who do that sort of stuff. I mean, heck, the 9/11 attackers had a huge paper trail. The US knew kind of a little bit what was going on, but they didn't draw the dots together. So if you're talking about, they couldn't even track an international conspiracy. Had a huge impact. How less likely are they going to have one dude with a gun? Like, it's just a risk in the world that bad things happen, and you have to accept it.
Can I just say one thing about those the 19 attackers on 9/11, and one reason why I hate the basically the TSA. Americans, right? I've been there a few times now. Your TSA is targeting the wrong people, right? Those guys.
It's targeting ordinary travelers.
It's targeting ordinary travelers. Those 19 guys who overtook those American Airlines planes, they were flying first class. First class people don't have to go through that shit.
Really?
No.
Wow, there you go.
Which is why I start flying first class now. Because now I don't have to get bothered by TSA. It is the best thing in the world.
Why would the TSA bother someone like you?
That's exactly
those brown-skinned people.
Have you guys seen that skit by those comedians about the TSA and how Al Qaeda is like, you know, sitting around discussing how genius the TSA is, and like,
I think I might have seen that.
The Colgate tubes are just, you know, a little too small to fit a bomb in, and you know, things like of that absurd nature.
Yeah.
Just I have some numbers, by the way. I did say I would look up numbers, and I do have some numbers. So worldwide, odds of getting killed by a terrorist is about 1 in 500,000. So pretty high. However, it's important to note about 6,000 of those deaths were in Iraq, and a good majority of the rest were in the Middle East, and that includes a lot of things done by ISIS. So that's about equivalent to being killed in your bathtub. Odds of a terrorist death. In Australia, over the last 10 years, we've had three deaths related to a terrorist incident. So that comes out to about 1 in 80 million. So that's about 20 times less likely than getting struck by lightning in Australia of getting killed by a terrorist. So just putting things in perspective.
So what do I need to do to avoid getting struck by lightning?
You need metadata laws. You need, all these laws,
We
man.
need to ban lightning.
Ban lightning.
Clearly, we need to get Malcolm Turnbull on this, right? Like, there needs to be some proper research on
The larger point
avoiding.
is this is something that
You
is
need a proper
really
system of lightning control. I mean,
Discipline.
you need
Any
to
other
regulate it.
single cause.
You need to do background checks on lightning.
Sorry, I just want to
Go on.
let Austin finish.
Go on.
This is a split. If this was any other cause of death that caused 3 deaths, you wouldn't hear about it. It wouldn't be news. 3 deaths over 10 years,
No.
that's nothing. That would not be news. The fact is that terrorism is effective because we allow those 3 deaths to become news.
Yeah.
That's what gives terrorism its power. Because we see 3 deaths, and we're not just like, that's really sad, we'll move on with our lives. We see 3 deaths, and we invent the TSA, and we pass metadata laws, and we change our way of life in response to these statistically sad but insignificant events. That's
So
why
just-
terrorism has power.
So just to correct that, in Australia it's actually border fast, but
Border fast.
sorry, border force. I've been saying border fast for too long.
Which
Anyway,
can I just quickly interrupt just before you wrap up, because I know you're about to. That's why I think we should abolish all terminology with terrorism and just make it about murder, because that's what it is. This guy killed somebody, walked up to somebody and shot him in the head. If some guy did that in the King's Cross, it would be terrible. But
no,
it would.
that's
It would
how you get
Activated,
lockout
man.
laws.
yeah, well, it's true. But
One punch
it's
law.
because politicians have cloaked what is essentially just murders in this scary language of terrorism. It allows them to create all this massive infrastructure to spy on people
No, it's
and to invade their
politically
freedom
motivated, and I
and all
think
these
it
terrible
goes to
things.
a little bit more than that, but I
Well,
don't
what
agree
the
with
thoughts
that.
in somebody's head
I
shouldn't.
would like to emphasize
Certainly
that 4 out
it's
of 4
used
libertarians
respect.
do agree that terrorism is bad. Just let's be on record
Yeah.
as saying that.
Okay, you know what? If I just let you guys talk, you're just gonna go ramble and ramble, ramble, which is why I'm ending it now, right? So that's episode 30. Okay, that is the end. We will catch everyone next week, and with hopefully more interesting topics that are.
I'll
You
talk
know-
less and make more jokes, I promise.
Yeah. Sorry.
Along
And
with night,
just
it's time
and
to
I
say
just
goodbye.
want to finish by saying the light of liberty attracts a few moths, because that I think is actually a good quote, and I'm gonna coin it right now.
Well done, Vickers.
Thanks.
Okay. Good night.
Good night.